It's really sad news that brings us here today for this deep dive. We want to acknowledge the passing of Jonathan Joss. He was an actor many of you listening will definitely recognize from, well, shows like King of the Hill, Parks and Recreation.
Yeah, really familiar face and voice. A definite loss.
Absolutely. And, like often happens when someone well-known passes away, especially under such tragic circumstances, the story. Well, it gets complicated pretty quickly as different bits of information come out.
Right.
So our goal here in this deep dive is to take the source materials we have, news articles, police statements, things posted online, and sort of unpack them together. We want to lay out what these different sources are reporting about how he died, knowing that the picture they paint is.
Well, it's complex, sometimes difficult, even conflicting in places. And that's the key thing, isn't it? We have to be really clear that we're sticking strictly to what these specific sources say. We're just presenting the information, the claims, exactly as they appear in those materials, especially when we get to the sensitive parts of the accounts that don't quite line up.
Exactly. We're here to help you understand the different facets of the story as they've been reported.
Okay.
So let's start with the basics from the sources. Who is Jonathan Joss?
Okay.
The material confirms he was born December 22nd, 1965, and he died, tragically, at 59 on Sunday, June 2nd, 2025.
And the sources make a point of highlighting his background, an actor, a producer of Apache and Comanche descent. And they note the kind of representation he brought, often praised, contemporary Native American representation in his roles.
Right, absolutely. And for so many people, that instantly means John Redcorn on King of the Hill. He took over that voice role from Victor Aaron back in '98 and voiced him right through 2009. And the sources point out, like you said, his portrayal was really appreciated, authentic, funny.
Yeah, really memorable character. And then, of course, there's Chief Ken Hotate in Parks and Recreation.
Oh, yeah.
Appeared in, 5 episodes between 2011 and 2015. And again, the sources mention praise for his comedy, his timing, maybe some improvisation in there, too.
His career was much broader, though. The sources show it started way back in 1994. They list things like Walker, Texas Ranger, the movie 8 Seconds.
Right, I remember him in that.
He played Kicking Wolf in those miniseries, Dead Man's Walk and Comanche Moon. And the material highlights that role specifically for kind of breaking stereotypes.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And he was also in the remake of The Magnificent Seven in 2016, and more recently shows like Tulsa King, Ray Donovan.
So a really diverse career. The sources also mentioned voice work for video games, and he played in the band, too.
Yeah, it seems like he had a lot of creative interests, but what really stands out, looking at the timeline, is how active he still was with those big roles. Just literally days before he died, the sources say he was at the ATX Television Festival.
Right, that big TV gathering in Austin.
Exactly, for the King of the Hill revival. And apparently, he'd already recorded lines for the new season 14, supposed to be in episode 2, maybe more.
Wow.
And sources mention interviews from around that time where he sounded really enthusiastic about the revival, about his career in general.
That just makes it feel even more sudden, doesn't it? Especially knowing he was right in the middle of projects people were really looking forward to.
It really does. Which unfortunately leads us right to the core of this, the incident itself. The basic facts, as reported in the sources we have, are that Jonathan Joss died after a shooting in San Antonio. This was Sunday night, June 2nd.
Police were called out. The initial report said shooting in progress.
And when the officers got there, they found him near the road. EMS, the paramedics were there too, and they pronounced him deceased at the scene.
And a suspect was arrested pretty quickly. The sources identify him as Sigfredo Alvarez Cia. He was Joss's neighbor, 56 years old.
Right, and he's been charged with murder. Some of the reports we look at specify first-degree murder.
The suspect apparently tried to leave the scene in a car, but police stopped him just about a block away, according to the reports.
So those are the sort of the basic reported facts of what happened that night.
Yeah. But that's just the starting point in the sources, isn't it? They immediately get into the circumstances, the history leading up to it, and that's where we start seeing different perspectives. Most notably, the account from Jonathan Joss's husband, Tristan Kern de Gonzalez.
Yes, the sources confirm they were married. They'd actually just exchanged vows this year, on Valentine's Day.
And according to a statement from Tristan Kern de Gonzalez, which was shared on Joss's Facebook page, apparently, the two of them were checking the mail when the shooting happened. And this was at the site of their former home.
And the sources really emphasize the significance of this place for Joss. It was his childhood home. His father built it way back in 1957.
Deep roots.
Yeah. And the material also points to some really tough times recently connected to that property. Their house there burned down in January.
A fire where they tragically lost their 3 dogs as well.
Just awful. Now, this is where Tristan Curran de Gonzalez's account, as presented in the sources, gives a very specific narrative about that fire. He claims it happened after more than 2 years of threats.
Threats from people in the area saying they'd set the house on fire.
That's what his statement claims, yes.
Yeah.
And he also claims these threats were reported to the police multiple times.
But according to him, nothing was done about it.
That's his assertion in the statement. And he goes further, stating they had faced openly homophobic harassment while living there.
Okay, so that's the backdrop he provides.
Right. And then his description of the moments right before the shooting, it's really disturbing. He states that while they were there checking the mail at the burned-out property, they found something horrific.
What was it?
The skull and harness of one of their dogs, one of the dogs lost in the fire in January, placed in clear view, according to his statement, near the mailbox.
Oh, my goodness.
He says finding that caused them understandably severe emotional distress. They started yelling, crying out.
I can only imagine.
And it was right then, while they were reacting to that horrible discovery, that G. Gonzalez says a man, the neighbor, the one later arrested, approached them.
Okay.
And according to D. Gonzalez's statement, this man immediately started yelling violent homophobic slurs at them, then raised a gun and fired.
Wow. Just like that, according to the statement.
That's the account. D. Gonzalez is also quoted in the sources saying that both he and Joss were unarmed at the time, not threatening anyone.
And then there's that incredibly powerful detail he shares.
Yes. D. Gonzalez states that Jonathan Joss actually pushed him out of the way when the gun was fired.
Saving his life.
He's quoted directly, "He saved my life." And another quote that really stands out in the sources is, "Jonathan is my husband. He gave me more love in our time together than most people ever get. He was murdered by someone who could not stand the sight of 2 men loving each other."
Such a powerful, heartbreaking statement.
It really is. And D. Gonzalez also added a message for supporters. He said, instead of things like GoFundMe donations, he'd prefer people spread the word about the consistent injustice done to him, to us, and to our dogs. And he vowed to protect Joss's legacy.
Okay, so that's a very clear, very specific, and deeply personal account laid out in his statement, as reported in the sources.
Exactly. But as we mentioned, the sources also include other information, other perspectives that, well, they present a different picture, or at least add layers that conflict with parts of that narrative.
This is where it gets tricky to navigate, just presenting what's there.
It is. So the San Antonio Police Department released a statement. It's included in the source materials, and it directly addresses those claims about the motive.
What did they say?
Their statement reads, their investigation has found no evidence whatsoever to indicate that Mr. Joss's murder was related to his sexual orientation.
No evidence whatsoever. That's quite definitive.
It is. They do add that they take allegations like that seriously, and if new evidence came up, they'd charge accordingly. But as of the time of that statement, they were saying no evidence linked it to a hate crime.
Okay, so the police statement focuses specifically on the motive for the shooting itself. But other reports in the sources fill in some background about interactions at that property, right?
Yes. For instance, some sources mention police had been called out to that residence dozens of times.
Dozens, wow.
Yeah, and many of those calls apparently involved disturbances, specifically with a neighbor.
Which neighbor? The one arrested.
The sources strongly imply that yes. Reports from places like TMZ and also accounts from other neighbors cited in the material suggest Joss and the suspect, Sigfredo Seja, had a long history of disputes.
What kind of disputes?
Sources mention past verbal and physical fights. They paint a picture of tensions that had been building up for years.
So a long-running neighbor conflict, potentially.
That seems to be what those sources suggest. And some neighbor accounts, also reported in the sources, describe Jonathan Joss's behavior in recent months. They use words like a little quirky.
Quirky how?
While sources say neighbors reported seeing him come out into the street sometimes yelling, trying to stop cars. One neighbor is quoted seeing him just moments before the shooting looking visibly upset, a little loud, waving his hands around.
Okay, so descriptions of perhaps erratic behavior.
That's what those neighbor accounts in the sources seem to suggest, yes. And the sources also bring up Joss's own public comments just days before he died.
At that festival.
Right, the ATX TV festival.
Yeah.
He reportedly took a microphone during a panel or event and said his house burned down because I'm gay.
So he himself linked the fire to homophobia publicly.
He did, according to those reports. The sources also mentioned that some people who were there at that panel apparently found his behavior at that time to be somewhat erratic as well.
Okay, now there's another layer in some of the sources, right? We need to be careful how we present this.
Extremely careful. One source we reviewed specifically, an online discussion on Reddit that was citing other reports, included claims about alternative reasons for the house fire.
Not arson by neighbors, as the husband suggested.
Right. These claims, reported in that Reddit source, suggested it might have been related to, say, utilities being cut off and maybe an attempt to use a grill inside for heat or cooking. Again, this is presented purely as a claim found within that source material, citing other reports.
Just one possibility raised in one corner of the source material.
Exactly. And that same Reddit discussion also contained claims attributed to neighbors about other alleged behaviors. Things like claims of threats made by Joss towards neighbors involving crossbows, or reports of hearing regular gunshots from potentially both properties.
Okay, so let's reiterate strongly. These are claims reported within one specific source, citing other reports. Not verified facts presented by us. We're just showing the breadth of what's out there in the materials provided.
Absolutely. It's crucial. So you really see these different narratives taking shape in the sources, don't you?
You do. You have the husband's powerful account focused on a hate crime, stemming from years of alleged harassment and threats.
Then you have the police statement saying currently no evidence supports a hate crime motive for the murder itself.
And alongside that, you have these other reports detailing what sounds like a very long-running, possibly escalating neighbor dispute, with accounts of erratic behavior, maybe on both sides, according to some of those claims.
It paints a really complex, tragic picture with these conflicting elements within the sources themselves. And with the investigation still ongoing, the sources just reflect these different, sometimes very challenging viewpoints right now.
And our job is just to lay out what that source material contains as impartially as we can.
Precisely. And amidst all this difficulty, the sources also capture the reaction from the wider community, his industry, to his passing.
Yeah, there seems to have been a real outpouring of tributes from colleagues, from fans, people who knew his work.
Definitely. The creators of King of the Hill, Mike Judge, Greg Daniels, Saladin Patterson, they put out a joint statement.
What did they say?
They acknowledged his long contribution to the show, mentioning John Redcorn specifically, and said he'd worked on the upcoming revival too. They finished by saying, "His voice will be missed at King of the Hill, and we extend our deepest condolences to Jonathan's friends and family."
That's touching. And his Parks and Rec co-stars too.
Yeah, Nick Offerman is quoted in sources, called Joss such a sweet guy and said the cast was heartbroken.
Ah.
And Chris Pratt also shared a tribute describing Joss as always such a kind dude.
It sounds like he made a real personal connection with people he worked with. And his husband also mentioned in his statement how much Joss valued his fans, right? Saw them like family.
Yes, he did. These tributes really underscore the personal loss, losing a creative person who clearly meant a lot to many people, both personally and through his work.
For sure.
So that's essentially what the sources we've looked at share about this incredibly complex and deeply sad story surrounding Jonathan Joss's death. We've touched on his life, his career.
Right, the incident itself, the basic reported facts.
And then these various, sometimes conflicting accounts about the history, the circumstances leading up to the shooting, his husband's perspective, the police statements, the neighbor accounts, and those other claims found in some reports.
And we've stressed that the investigation is ongoing. The source materials we have right now just reflect these different narratives about motive, about the events beforehand.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with, based on all this. Given these conflicting narratives we find in the sources, the layers of personal history, public statements, the alleged community disputes, what does this tragic situation, as it's reported, tell us about maybe the challenge of really understanding complex human events based only on the information we have available at any one time?
Or perhaps, what does it say about how the impact of someone's creative voice, like his, endures, even when they're silenced in such tragic, public, and frankly very uncertain circumstances?